You wake up in a medieval village. Not a castle. Not even a stone house. No, you live in something that technically qualifies as shelter, assuming your standards include walls that let wine through and a roof mostly made of panic and wet straw. It's chilly. Your blanket smells like a fermented goat. And that's the good blanket. You open your eyes, and before your brain even has time to decide if it's worth living another day, you hear it. Your neighbor. Again. At it. Again. He's not shouting exactly. He's just loudly existing. Which in the 14th century is more offensive than you'd think. Because when the walls are thinner than your patience and the only thing separating you from the guy next door is a goat bladder stretched across some twigs, every cough, grunt, and poorly executed lute solo feels like a personal attack. And no, you can't just move. Property rights? Hilarious. You were born here. You'll die here. Probably right in that itchy hay pile you call a bed. Maybe with a spoon in your hand, because it's the only thing your neighbors haven't stolen yet. Now before you get too comfortable, maybe you're cozy under a blanket of your own, or slowly letting your eyes get heavy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy this bizarre brand of historical insomnia. And hey, leave a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it for you? I'm always fascinated by who's out there at 3 a.m. listening to descriptions of peasant arguments from the year 1286. Anyway, back to your loud neighbor. He's yelling again. Something about pigs. Probably your pigs. Or his pigs. Or the pigs that have been mysteriously pooping in his turnip patch and that he insists have your look in their eye. You get up, step into your wooden clogs, and splash directly into a puddle of something. You don't ask. You've stopped asking. You do what every rational medieval person does when confronting a domestic disturbance. You walk outside, and you stare at him passive-aggressively for about 14 seconds. That's all it takes. That's the entire conflict resolution process. See, there's no such thing as calling the cops. There is a local constable, but he's 62, drunk, and missing both knees. He once arrested a chicken for being disrespectful, so expectations are low. The real justice system is gossip, and passive-aggressive staring, and sometimes actual aggressive butter theft. What people rarely understand about the Middle Ages is that it wasn't all jousting and plague. Mostly, it was just quietly resenting the people who lived 2 feet from your head. There's a myth that medieval villages were full of camaraderie and shared bread and singing. And they were. Occasionally. But mostly, it was "don't touch my goose," followed by 40 years of silent seething. Your neighbor might help you build a fence one day, and then poison your well with pig urine the next. Why? Because your son accidentally sheared his sheep last spring. It's generational warfare now. And what can you do about it? Not much. You could accuse him of theft. But you'd need at least 2 reputable male witnesses. Which is hard, because all the reputable men are either dead in the Crusades or pretending not to know you because you owe them a wheelbarrow. Plus, if your accusation fails, you might get fined for wasting the court's time. So instead, you sigh. You grumble. You slam your thatch door with dramatic flair. And you start quietly planning revenge, like a true medieval professional. Let's talk about revenge. Petty revenge is the cornerstone of medieval neighbor relations. You don't go for the big stuff. You go for the slew, maddening, impossible-to-prove sabotage. You wait until he's drying his socks on a stick. Then you accidentally knock it over while fetching water. You trip into his cabbage patch. You forget to feed his chickens when he's away for a funeral. Then you act shocked, when they peck his wife's new shoes into oblivion. If you're particularly bold, you might go nuclear, fake illness, blame him, and start a rumor. Just a little one. Oh, I don't know, ever since Jarek brought that odd meat stew to the midsummer feast, I've just felt off. Suddenly, Jarek's under suspicion for witchcraft. Or worse, food poisoning. Either way, your turnips grow in peace for the next 3 seasons. Of course, sometimes it escalates. Someone throws a rock. Someone else throws a bigger rock. Eventually, there's blood. And this is where medieval society really shines. You're both fined. That's right. You could be minding your own business, get stabbed in the foot with a pitchfork, and still owe the village council 3 shillings because you were clearly provoking him by having a smug expression. Fairness wasn't exactly the priority. Keeping the peace, however messily, Was. So, what were your options if things really got out of hand? There was always the local court, a delightful blend of superstition, bias, and men named things like Walter the Slightly Bent. You'd appear before a panel of vaguely literate elders who would sniff your tunic, scratch their beards, and determine guilt using a technique known as wild guessing. Sometimes they'd have you carry a hot iron bar. If your hand healed in 3 days, you were innocent. If not, tough luck. This was called trial by ordeal, which is an adorable euphemism for let's burn people and call it science. But courts were a last resort. First, you tried the time-honored method, escalating pettiness. This included everything from planting your fence 6 inches into your neighbor's field, classic, to singing passive-aggressive ballads outside his window. Yes, that's right. Medieval people weaponized folk songs. Imagine being woken at 5 a.m. by a lyre and someone softly chanting, "Oh, the swine of Willem wander far, into fields not his own by right." And no, you can't tell them to stop, because that would mean you're offended. And if you're offended, that means they won. You're not sure when the feud started. No one is. Feuds often lasted generations. There are records of families in 13th century France that maintained grudges over the placement of a single beehive for 87 years. People were stabbed over honey. Stabbed. And don't even get me started on millwrights, because if you build a windmill in the wrong direction, that's like declaring war. Medieval villages didn't have HOAs. They were the HOA. But instead of regulations about lawn height, it was who gets to use the shared dung pile, or who owns that chicken that keeps wandering across the lane like it's got a death wish. You go back inside. Your neighbor's shouting has faded, but you know it's not over. It's never over. You sit down for breakfast. It's the same as yesterday, barley porridge with a side of regret. No coffee. No sugar. Just something beige, chewy, and vaguely sad. You hear a knock. You freeze. It's your other neighbor, the quiet one. She's smiling, which is always suspicious. She brings you a gift. Some bread. You don't trust it. Last time she brought you gift bread, you spent 2 days talking to your boots and vomiting into a moss bucket. But you accept it, because declining would be rude. And rudeness, in medieval times, is practically a declaration of blood feud. You eat the bread anyway. Because in this era, death by petty pastry is just part of life. Now, while you digest your probably cursed carbs, let's reflect on what community means in this era. You live with these people. You will marry one of their cousins. You will lend them your ox, and they will return it slightly more dead than it left. You will attend their weddings, funerals, and suspiciously long livestock auctions. Your lives are inextricably tied, which makes every argument feel personal. But that's the thing. In the Middle Ages, there was no blocking someone. You couldn't move away. There were no cities with anonymity. You had 5 neighbors, and if you hated 2 of them, well, 40% of your entire social circle is now emotionally radioactive. This is why pettiness was so refined. Because murder was messy, and exile meant dying in the woods. But a sarcastic comment during Mass? That's an art form. Even the church got involved. Priests would host peace sermons where everyone had to publicly forgive each other. Imagine being forced to stand next to the man who stole your wife's ducks and say, "Yes, I do forgive Osric, even though he's a two-faced turnip-suckling snake with no soul." Then you'd be expected to shake hands, while maintaining eye contact, and somehow not burst into flames from pure rage. Still, despite all this, people found a way to coexist. There were festivals, communal bread ovens, occasional moments of shared laughter, when the local pig got drunk on fermented apples and chased the blacksmith into a well. These little things mattered, because without them, the entire system would collapse into pure chaos. And while medieval life was many things, damp, itchy, dangerously flammable, it did have rules. Unspoken ones. Like don't sleep with your neighbor's wife unless she gives you 2 eggs and a subtle nod. Or never, under any circumstances, comment on the smell coming from old Elfric's house. You just didn't. These social rules were sacred, because they were the only thing holding your village together. That, and the shared agreement that nobody actually liked the miller. Ah yes, the miller. You wake up. Again. This time, to the sound of something wet and angry being hurled against your wall. It's raining. Inside your house. Well, not technically raining. It's more of a persistent, resentful dripping from the ceiling directly onto your face. You try to move your head an inch to the left. The straw pokes you. You try an inch to the right. Still dripping. A perfect medieval alarm clock, handcrafted from despair and roof leaks. You sigh. It's morning in the village again. Which means the following 4 things are true. Your bread is stale. Your feet are damp. Someone is arguing. You're too tired to care, but too poor to ignore it. The arguing, naturally, involves the miller. Ah yes, the miller. The mun, the myth, the smug flour-covered goblin who controls the most powerful institution in your entire known universe, the grain mill. You can grow your own wheat. You can harvest it. You can dance around it at the midsummer festival. But you cannot, under any circumstances, turn it into edible flour without paying this man a fee so absurd it would make a 14th century banker blush. Because the miller, a position so universally hated it could unite lifelong enemies, has what is known as the right of soak, which sounds like a medieval disease, but is actually far worse. It's a legal monopoly that says you must grind your grain at his mill or not at all. Trying to grind it at home? Illegal. That's right. Making your own flour was literally a crime. Because if there's one thing the feudal system hated, it was you having a good time. And the miller? Oh, he knows. He's got a fancy hat. His wife has shoes. Not wooden ones. Actual leather. Imported. He wears a smirk so permanent, you want to hit it with a turnip. But you don't. Because he also owns the mill pond. And his cousin is the bailiff. And his nephew is married to the Reeves' niece. Which basically means he's royalty. But the worst part? He's always cheating. You know it. Everyone knows it. Even the pigs know it. He accidentally takes a little extra grain when you're not looking. The weights are suspiciously heavy. His scale malfunctions. And yet, when you complain, you're told that's just how it is. Which, to be fair, is the unofficial motto of the Middle Ages. You trudge through the mud to confront him. You've had enough. You demand he return the extra handful he definitely skimmed off your barley. He laughs. He laughs. And then offers you a half-empty sack of rye and a sarcastic bow. You could report him. Sure. But the village court meets once a month. If it rains, and it always rains, the judge probably won't show. And even if he does, your only witness is old Gert, who swears bread hasn't tasted right since 1314, but also believes cows can see ghosts. So instead, you do what every proud medieval commoner does when faced with systemic corruption. You gossip. You head straight to the alehouse, find the most talkative person who's still upright, and you start talking about how the miller's wife has been spending an unusual amount of time near the tanner's hut. Within 2 hours, the rumor will have evolved into a full affair involving 3 sheep, a missing rosary, and possibly the ghost of a nun. You smile. Justice, in its own soggy little way, has been served. Of course, this just adds fuel to the neighborly fire. Because now everyone is gossiping. And when everyone's gossiping, nobody's farming. And when nobody's farming, the steward gets nervous. And when the steward gets nervous, people start being fined for extremely real and definitely not made-up crimes like insulting the dignity of the bailiff's chicken or spreading discontent through laughter. This is how you end up, once again, face to face with your most consistent adversary, not the miller, not the bailiff, but your immediate neighbor, Tom with an H. Tom with an H is not to be confused with Tom without an H, who lives 2 cottages over and is only mildly annoying. No, Tom with an H is the type of man who sharpens his scythe at 5 a.m. just to prove point. He insists on singing Gregorian chants out of key. And he insists his ducks are blessed, which is a weird way to describe livestock that keeps pooping in your water bucket. Tom accuses you of stealing firewood. You laugh. Not because it's funny, but because it's technically true. But also, in your defense, it was extremely cold and extremely unattended. And anyway, you were going to return it. Probably. Maybe. At some point. Okay, no, you burned it. But still. You try to explain this in terms that will de-escalate the situation. Unfortunately, all medieval conflict resolution strategies involve threatening to duel, quoting a vague Bible passage, throwing a turnip. You go with the third option. Tom throws one back. And suddenly, you're in a full-on produce standoff, standing ankle-deep in mud, flinging root vegetables at a man who once tried to marry your sister purely to inherit her cow. You don't want to escalate. You really don't want to escalate. Because the last time two neighbors escalated in this village, it ended in an excommunication, a 4-day fasting ritual, and someone having to walk 14 miles to apologize to a bishop who definitely did not care. But Tom has pushed you too far. So, you resort to the most powerful weapon in the medieval neighbor arsenal. You curse him. Not real magic. No one's officially allowed to do that since the church got cranky about sorcery. But the socially acceptable version of cursing, muttering loud enough for the local widow to hear, and then pretending you were just talking to yourself. I do hope no chickens come to roost in his chimney this winter, you say casually, while pretending to squeak. Would be a shame if the spirits of the woods heard about his missing debts. Tom hears. So does his wife. And 3 other people who are absolutely going to exaggerate the whole thing into a dramatic tale involving love potions and haunted flower. By the time sunset arrives, half the village believes you summoned a plague of toads. You didn't. But you're not going to deny it either. Because fear is a kind of respect. By twilight, the drama has settled. For now, you light your single, precious candle. You try not to think about the miller, or Tom, or the fact that you still haven't found your axe since your other neighbor borrowed it in 1327 and forgot. You sip something that calls itself ale but tastes like fermented shoes. You think, briefly, about justice, about fairness, about moving to the city. Then you remember the city has crime, plague, and rent. And suddenly, Tom doesn't seem so bad. This is your life. This is medieval social life. It is loud, unfair, petty, and deeply personal. You know everyone. They know you. And every single interaction is layered with 30 years of suspicion and shared trauma involving goats. But you survive. You gossip. You curse. You forgive, eventually. Not because you want to, but because the midwinter feast is coming and you really want someone else to bring the pies. And so, as the candle burns low and the smell of turnip stew clings to your everything, you lie down and let your body sink into the straw. You stare up at the leaking ceiling and let the sound of your neighbors arguing about the moon's position lull you into something that might resemble rest. You dream of quiet. It never comes. But the sound of medieval grudges, whispered through wattle and daub, is oddly comforting. Sleep. You wake up to singing. Not pleasant singing. Not minstrel outside your window with a lute and a tragically romantic backstory singing. No. This is the kind of singing that makes your ears fold in self-defense. It's the tanner's daughter. Again. She's doing that thing where she sings old folk ballads at full volume while scraping hides outside your window. And she's adding extra verses. Loud ones. About lazy neighbors and cowards who can't build fences straight. You're not mentioned by name. But neither is anyone else with a crooked fence, and you happen to have the only one in town shaped like a drunk snake. You stare at the ceiling. There is no escape. The tanner's daughter, her name is Maud, not that you ever asked, has made passive aggression into an Olympic sport. If sarcasm were a weapon, she'd have conquered France. Twice. She's 22, unmarried, and absolutely furious about it. She blames the village, the weather, and you, specifically, for stealing all the eligible men with your soup and your mysterious herbs. You don't even make soup. But facts have never gotten in Maud's way before. Maud's father, the tanner, is no help. He smells like boiled leather and eternal regret. He's gone half-deaf from years of pounding animal skins with sticks and lies, so he just nods at everything and yells what, at intervals. He once accidentally betrothed her to a man who was already dead. The wedding feast was still better than most. So now, Maud lives next door, harbors a deep loathing for your garden, your general existence, and possibly your shadow, and expresses it through song. You've tried everything. Ignoring her, she sings louder. Complimenting her voice, she takes it as sarcasm. Praying for divine intervention, God seems busy. Leaving flowers on her doorstep, she thought they were hexes and burned them in a bowl. So instead, you've learned to work around her. You time your chores to avoid her. You draw water from the well before sunrise, before she wakes up and starts her daily tirade about loose ends and unholy whisperings near her fence. You take the back path to the stream, so you don't have to hear about her cousin who was cursed after borrowing someone's ladder. And you definitely avoid her on market day, where she stands in front of the vegetable stall loudly announcing your alleged debts to the onion seller. Still, conflict is inevitable. Like taxes, or rain, or the lice you definitely didn't catch from the ale bench. It comes to a head over a pig. Not just any pig, your pig. You think. Possibly. The pig in question, a plump, self-important creature with a limp and an attitude, wandered into Maud's garden. You're not sure how. You have a fence. It has holes, but still. Maud claims this is the third time it's happened. You think it's the first. Maud also claims the pig glared at her, which feels subjective. She marches up to your door, holding the pig by a rope. She is red-faced, out of breath, and already halfway through her speech before you've even opened your mouth. You'll be paying for the turnips, she declares, shaking the rope like a sacred relic. And the radishes. And the emotional distress. You stare at the pig. The pig stares back. Neither of you feel like negotiating. Now, under medieval custom, specifically the assize of pigs, which is somehow a real thing, livestock damage is a you problem. If your pig destroys someone's vegetables, you owe compensation. But Maud is asking for a full bushel of barley, 2 eggs, and an apology in front of the church. That's extortion. You offer her a handful of leeks. She throws them on the ground and storms off, dragging the pig behind her. The pig looks back once, possibly out of guilt, possibly because it just remembered it left something behind, possibly because it's not even your pig. Either way, it's gone. And now, you are at war, which, in medieval neighbor terms, means the following. She will no longer acknowledge your presence. She will begin leaving accidental piles of tanning waste near your window. She will sing twice as loud. With harmonies, you respond with the usual arsenal. Loud prayers, a pointed sermon request to the priest titled On the Evils of Vindictiveness, and a highly conspicuous placement of St. Cuthbert's effigy facing her cottage. The village notices. They always notice. Within days, it's all anyone can talk about. You've triggered what's known, unofficially, as a quiet feud. It's not open conflict. No one's throwing punches. But the tension is thick enough to churn. Every action is loaded with meaning. Every glance carries centuries of cultural baggage. Every bread trade is a potential insult. You wave at her mother? That's a power move. You don't wave? That's a bigger power move. You say nothing at all? Clearly you're summoning demons. Even the local priest, a man so non-confrontational he once apologized to a tree, gets involved. He gently suggests that neighbors ought not dwell in the spirit of resentment, which is medieval code for please stop harassing each other with passive-aggressive vegetables. You agree. Maud agrees. For exactly 3 days. Then, she dumps pig droppings into your path and tells the weaver you did it to yourself for sympathy. You consider moving. Or becoming a hermit. You briefly entertain the idea of joining a monastery, until you remember that monks wake up at 3 a.m. and eat boiled kale. So you do what any reasonable medieval person would do in your situation. You write a song. Not a good one. Not even a coherent one. But you hum it loudly outside her cottage, just long enough to be heard. It includes references to foul smells, false turnips, and a voice like a boiled frog. You even rhyme sinner with vinegar. She glares. You smile. Mutual destruction has never felt so cathartic. And just like that, the feud evolves. Because here's the thing about medieval neighbor relationships, they're like compost piles. Hot, messy, occasionally useful, and entirely dependent on what you feed them. Sometimes the feud ends with a truce. A peace offering of bread or cider or mutual disdain for a third party, usually the reeve. Sometimes it ends with a marriage. Not yours, thankfully, but someone's. And sometimes it never ends. It just settles. Like mud. Like dust. Like everything else in this endless, damp little corner of the world. Eventually, you and Maud stop acknowledging each other. Not out of forgiveness, but fatigue. You still loathe each other. You just have better things to do. Like surviving winter. Or boiling water for the 15th time to chase off the weird floating things. One day, her pig wanders into your yard again. You stare at it. It stares back. You sigh. And without a word, you walk it home. She says nothing. You say nothing. The silence is deafening. But the feud is over. For now. Because in the end, medieval life isn't about grand battles or dramatic betrayals. It's about the slow, grinding, petty grind of everyday annoyance. It's about shared wells, shared fences, and shared grievances passed down like heirlooms. It's about learning how to coexist with the people who make you wish you were born a squirrel. You don't love your neighbors. You don't even like them. But they're part of a landscape. Like the mud. Like the mold. Like the vague smell of cabbage that never truly leaves your clothes. And so, as night falls again, thick, smoky, and filled with distant arguing, you lie back, close your eyes, and drift off to sleep, knowing full well that tomorrow you'll probably wake up to another song, and possibly another pig. You wake up to yelling. Again. This time, it's not Maud. Miraculously, she's busy berating the cooper about the inappropriate curvature of his barrels. You'd think barrels were a matter of personal taste, but apparently, Maud has strong feelings about symmetry. No, this morning's yelling is coming from your southern border. Not southern as in Spain or something romantic. You're not a knight, but the southern end of your 3-rod-wide garden, where your land ends and Geoffrey's begins. Geoffrey is the kind of man who introduces himself by correcting the pronunciation of his own name. He insists on Joffrey, which is absurd because everyone in town calls him Goffrey, and half the village can't read anyway. He wears shoes indoors, has opinions on tax collection, and once started a small fire trying to purify his carrots. You suspect he was dropped on the head as a child. Repeatedly. Possibly by his own mother. The dispute today is about a fence. Or rather, the vague concept of where your fence should be, according to Geoffrey's sudden and passionate discovery of ancient local boundary laws, which he is now reading from a piece of bark he claims is legal parchment. You peer over the fence, which is, in fact, leaning, just not in the direction he says it is. It's half a hand's length too far into my plot, Geoffrey insists, pointing dramatically at some moss. You ask if he's measuring by hands or hallucinations. He doesn't laugh. Geoffrey doesn't do humor. He does rules and measurements and long pauses before saying technically. Now, you'd like to let this slide. Truly. You've got bigger problems. Like the flea bites on your ankles. Or the fact that your thatch is slipping again and your roof looks like it's trying to shrug itself off the cottage. But Geoffrey won't let it go. He wants a resurvey. Yes, a resurvey. In the year of our Lord 1382. In a village where half the people don't know what Tuesday means. He wants to bring in the reeve, 2 witnesses, and the local measuring cord, which is mostly knots and hope, to determine if your fence, built with your own hands, is violating communal harmony. Which is rich, coming from a man who once tried to charge tolls for letting people pass through a cowpath. Now, back in the day, and by day we mean about 4 generations ago, give or take a plague, the land boundaries were marked by beating the bounds. A charming local tradition where once a year, the entire village, led by the priest, some drunk elders, and a group of very confused children, would walk the edge of the parish, smacking landmarks with sticks and occasionally each other. This, surprisingly, was considered a legal act. The logic being, if we hit it with a stick every year, it must be ours. You propose this to Geoffrey. He's horrified. He believes in documents. You believe in sticks. So now you're at an impasse. A medieval impasse, mind you, which involves a lot more standing around and coughing than it does action. Geoffrey goes to the reeve. The reeve sighs audibly and pretends he has reeve things to do, which usually involves hiding in the granary and hoping no one remembers about tithes. Eventually, he agrees to come inspect your fence. But not before Geoffrey accuses you of fence-shifting sorcery. You don't even know sorcery. Okay, you once borrowed a charm from old widow Elspeth to keep your cabbage from rotting, but that barely counts. And anyway, the cabbage still rotted, possibly out of spite. Now you have a full-blown dispute. In medieval England, this means everyone within shouting distance becomes a legal expert. You're told by the blacksmith that any fence older than 12 years becomes sacred by right of turf. The baker says you should have peed on the border to mark it. Someone else claims the boundary was once settled in a dream by their cousin, who's touched by angels. The reeve arrives with a measuring rope and an expression of pure resignation. He looks at the fence. He looks at Geoffrey. He looks at you. Well, he says, rubbing his temple like someone trying to erase their own memories. It is leaning. You explain, calmly. That it's not your fault the wind always blows from the south, and your fence is made of half-rotted willow sticks, which were donated, thank you very much. Jeffrey counters by quoting something in Latin. It may or may not be from a real source. You don't speak Latin. Nobody speaks Latin. Not even the priest speaks Latin. He just chants it until it sounds holy, and then falls asleep. Eventually, after 3 hours, 6 interruptions, 1 small chicken-related incident, and a long speech from Jeffrey about property ethics, the Reeve declares, "The fence shall stay where it is, and both parties shall contribute 1 loaf of bread to the parish as penance for public nuisance." Which is medieval for I don't care who's right, just stop talking. You agree. Jeffrey huffs. You both bake bread. Yours is stale. His is worse. The priest blesses it anyway. Peace is restored. For now. But this whole experience has reminded you of an important truth about medieval neighborhood relations. No matter how much you try to avoid them, boundary disputes are inevitable. Why? Because your property is your pride. Your turnips are your retirement plan. Your crooked fence is the only thing standing between your chicken and Jeffrey's suspiciously aggressive goose. So you start fortifying. You plant hedges. You stack rocks. You borrow Elspeth's mildly cursed scarecrow and position it in a way that suggests, I'm watching you, but also I'm made of moss and revenge. And Jeffrey? He starts keeping a land log. A log with notches that he claims record rainfall, animal tracks, and suspicious foot patterns. He's turned into a one-man medieval HOA. You avoid eye contact. You consider tunneling out under the fence. You wonder what it's like to live somewhere that isn't made entirely of mold, politics, and poultry. But you don't move. You just keep living. Because in medieval life, neighbors aren't optional. They're part of the deal. Like soup that tastes like sadness. Or boots that never quite fit. You learn to navigate them. Through compromise, sarcasm, and occasionally, the quiet satisfaction of knowing your fence is only slightly crooked. And sometimes, just sometimes, they surprise you. One evening, after a particularly strong storm, part of your fence collapses. You prepare for Jeffrey to pounce, for another round of legal bark readings and passive-aggressive sermons. But instead, he helps fix it. Doesn't say a word. Just shows up with some extra stakes and a hammer. You work side by side in silence, interrupted only by the occasional grunt and the sound of a goose being tackled by your rooster. When you finish, he nods. You nod. Then he points to the horizon and mutters, you know, that cloud looks like it's coming from Maud's chimney. And just like that, you're allies. For now. Because even in the mud and madness of medieval life, nothing unites neighbors faster than hating the other neighbor. And so, as night falls, you sit by the hearth, listening to the wind rattle the shutters and the sound of Maud arguing with a goose. You lean back, sip your suspicious ale, and breathe deep the smell of slightly damp success. You've survived another day. Sleep. You'll need it. Because tomorrow, you'll have to borrow Jeffrey's shovel. And that's going to be awkward. You wake up to the unmistakable stench of burnt toast. No, wait. It's worse. It's the baker. Again. Now, in any other time or place, the smell of fresh bread would be a blessing. But in your village, the baker is less artisan breadsmith and more apocalyptic fire starter with dough. The smoke drifts across the street and settles in your nose like a bad memory. Today, the source of your suffering is not just his baking skills, but his choice to experiment with a new oven right next to your property line. You knew this was going to happen. The baker's oven is a sort of half-collapsed stone monstrosity that he calls a work in progress, but everyone calls a death trap. It spews smoke in all directions, sends sparks like tiny flaming arrows, and occasionally launches burning bits of something vaguely bread-like onto your roof. Your roof, if you recall, is already precarious. It leaks when the wind changes, the thatch is patchy, and the squirrels have taken to nesting in the eaves like tiny, judgmental landlords. The baker has set this inferno less than 2 feet from your shared fence, and the fence is definitely starting to look singed. You go over to complain. The baker's response? A cheerful grin, flour-dusted hands, and the declaration that great bread requires great risk. Besides, your fence adds character. You don't know whether to be insulted or impressed. Instead, you nod slowly and back away before you get caught in a cloud of smoke and existential despair. Now, you try to negotiate. You offer to build him a small stone wall between his oven and your fence. A wall made of actual stone, not the sticks and mud wall you had before. He agrees, but only if you help him build it. You accept, because sometimes peace means shared labor, and also because you're tired of cleaning soot out of your hair. Construction starts the next morning. It's loud. It's dusty. And the baker's singing is, well, let's call it enthusiastic. You try to focus on the task, stacking stones, mixing mortar, and avoiding catching your sleeve on something sharp. But inevitably, the neighbors show up. First, it's Maud, who demands to know why you're collaborating with the human smoke machine. She threatens to throw something, probably a turnip. Then Jeffrey comes by, curious about the project and how it affects his own plot boundary. He offers unsolicited advice on mortar mixing and insists on measuring every stone for compliance. Soon, half the village is gathered around, making suggestions, arguing about whose stone should be used first, and debating whether the wall should be exactly 3 feet tall or 3 feet in a handspan. You try to tune it all out. Eventually, the wall is finished. It's not perfect. The stones are uneven. The mortar is dry in some places and soggy in others. It leans a bit, mostly away from your side. But it stands. And, best of all, it blocks most of the smoke. The baker bakes bread with renewed enthusiasm, and the village benefits from slightly less burnt toast. You, however, gain a new appreciation for the noisy, quarrelsome, yet oddly cooperative community you share. Because, here's the thing about medieval neighbors, they're frustrating, unpredictable, and prone to petty squabbles. But when it counts, when the roof is leaking, or the fire is threatening to spread, or the pig is loose again, they come together. Maybe not gracefully, maybe not quietly, but together. You realize that living next to people like Maud, Jeffrey, and the baker is like living inside a particularly stubborn soap opera that never ends. The smell of burnt bread, the crooked fences, the singing ballads, it's all part of the soundtrack. And as you lay down that night, ears ringing with the distant sound of Maud's latest tune and the occasional squawk of an agitated goose, you smile. Because, annoying as they are, these neighbors are your world. Your maddening, noisy, wonderful world. And you wouldn't have it any other way. You wake up to a sound that is equal parts nightmare and folk music. Yes, it's the town minstrel. Or as you like to call him, the human foghorn. Now, before you get too judgmental, minstrels are the medieval version of Instagram influencers, but with fewer followers and a lot more loot. This guy, let's call him Oswald, has taken it upon himself to enlighten the village with his latest ballad about the heroic deeds of Sir Reginald, who once spilled his ale on a nobleman's foot and lived to tell the tale. You try to enjoy it. You really do. But Oswald's lute is out of tune. His voice cracks like a dozen ancient floorboards, and his timing is, let's just say, enthusiastically chaotic. You consider offering him earplugs, but remember that earplugs are not exactly a medieval thing. So instead, you step outside, hoping the fresh air will drown out the noise. But here's the kicker, Oswald's camp is right next to your property line. Because, of course it is. You try to reason with him. You explain the concept of quiet hours. He explains the concept of I sing when I want. You find yourself wishing you had a pet dragon to chase him off. But the village has strict rules about noise. Or, more accurately, the village has strict rules about silencing complaints, which mostly means if you want peace and quiet, you have to bribe the reeve or move out. Oswald, bless him, is blissfully unaware of these rules. His world revolves around 3 things: his lute, his audience, which mostly consists of irritated villagers, and the occasional tavern brawl. One evening, after a particularly enthusiastic rendition of Sir Reginald's ale disaster, the village council convenes an emergency meeting. You're there, of course. The reeve tries to mediate. The priest prays for patience. The baker offers stale bread as a peace offering. Oswald defends himself, arguing that his music lifts the spirit and preserves history, which is true if you consider history as a series of poorly sung mishaps. Eventually, the council decrees that Oswald must relocate his camp at least 100 paces from the village center, which, in medieval terms, means he can camp by your fence. Great. You spend the next weeks perfecting your annoyed stare and practicing subtle hints like suddenly forgetting to fetch water when he starts playing. At night, you dream of silence. But as it turns out, Oswald's singing isn't the worst neighborly nuisance. No, that honor goes to old Agnes. Agnes is a widow who lives next door and has an uncanny ability to borrow anything you own and never return it. You lend her a basket, gone. You lend her a kettle, gone. You lend her some salt. Well, salt doesn't exactly disappear, but it definitely depletes mysteriously in her kitchen. She also insists on telling you every detail of her cat's medical history, whether you want to hear it or not. You try to politely decline, but Agnes is relentless. One day, you find her favorite cloak hanging in her yard, patched together with scraps of fabric that definitely do not match. When you confront her, she insists it's a gift and that you should be grateful for the artistic touch. You are not grateful, but you smile and nod, because you're learning the key to surviving medieval neighbors. Sometimes you just have to pick your battles. And let the cloak be. Because next week, Maud will be complaining about your chickens, and Jeffrey will be building another mysterious structure that looks suspiciously like a fort. And Oswald will still be singing about spilled ale. Welcome to medieval life. It's loud, it's messy, and it smells like a mixture of damp wool and unwashed humanity. But it's home. And if you can survive Agnes, you can survive anything. You wake up to the sound of hammering. Not the gentle kind of hammering, like fixing a fence or patching a roof. No, this is the kind of hammering that sounds like someone is trying to build a catapult out of scrap wood in frustration. It's your neighbor, Jeffrey again. The self-appointed land surveyor, amateur architect, and professional irritant. Today, Jeffrey is constructing what he calls a boundary fortification, which looks suspiciously like a glorified chicken coop with spikes. He's hammering stakes into the ground with the enthusiasm of a man who has just discovered a new reason to argue. You step outside, rubbing sleep from your eyes and trying to pretend that you don't notice the gleam in Jeffrey's eye that screams, "I'm about to create a neighborly nightmare." "Good morning," you say cautiously. Jeffrey doesn't respond. He's too busy measuring the distance between stakes, muttering about security, privacy, and the sanctity of property. You inquire, delicately, what exactly this fortification is supposed to protect against. "Bandits," he says. You ask if bandits are really a problem in the village. He looks at you as if you've asked whether the sun rises in the east. Well, he admits, no. But you never know. Fair point. So, you watch as Jeffrey nails more spikes, piles up stones, and even sets a few rudimentary traps, none of which would fool anything bigger than a particularly stupid squirrel. The village children come by, daring each other to touch the spikes. You try to imagine a medieval HOA meeting where this is discussed and voted on. Spoiler, it would be mostly yelling, and then someone threatening to throw a pig on Jeffrey's property. Speaking of pigs, Maud appears, clutching a broom, and wearing an expression that suggests she's simultaneously furious and preparing to conduct an exorcism. She storms over, accusing Jeffrey of turning the village into a fortress and scaring off the friendly spirits. Jeffrey counters that Maud's chickens have been trespassing on his land and pooping where they shouldn't. This sparks a full-blown poultry and property feud. The Reeve is summoned once again, this time armed with a walking stick and a stack of parchments no one understands. After hours of debate, the conclusion is, well, there is no conclusion. Jeffrey's fortification stays. Maud's chickens roam freely. You just hope your own animals stay out of the crossfire. This little episode is a classic example of medieval neighborly life, full of suspicion, territorial disputes, and oddly creative solutions to problems that mostly don't exist. And while it might seem exhausting, it also brings a strange sense of rhythm to your days. You never know what the neighbors will do next. Will Jeffrey build a moat? Will Maud adopt a rooster that sounds like a foghorn? Will Oswald finally learn to play in tune? The uncertainty is part of the charm. Later that evening, as you sit by the fire, you reflect on the day. You realize that medieval neighbors were not just annoyances. They were part of the social fabric, woven together by necessity, frustration, and a shared existence that left little room for solitude. There were no fences tall enough, no laws strict enough, and no amount of complaining that could separate lives so deeply intertwined. You think about how this forced closeness, while maddening, also created bonds. Sometimes, the kind that helped you when the harvest failed, when sickness came, or when the roof finally collapsed under the weight of too many winters. So, you sip your ale, listen to the distant crow of Maud's newly adopted rooster, and brace yourself for whatever tomorrow brings. Because in this village, peace is as fragile as a clay pot, and just as easy to shatter. You wake up to the unmistakable and persistent smell of something burning. No, it's not the baker this time, nor is it Jeffrey's questionable bonfire experiments. It's your neighbor, Hilda, who has decided that today is the perfect day to dye her entire household's laundry. Now, laundering clothes in the medieval period is less of a chore and more of a full-contact sport involving cold water, stones, and the occasional whispered curse. Hilda's method, however, involves boiling vats of mysterious, brightly colored liquids over open fires, situated just behind her humble cottage, which, conveniently, happens to be right next to your window. You stumble outside, blinking against the morning sun and the thick, acrid smoke curling from her cauldron. Hilda waves cheerfully, a wooden spoon dripping with a suspiciously purple liquid in hand. She invites you over to try your hand at the ancient art of cloth dyeing. You politely decline, because you prefer your fingers unstained and your nostrils unburnt. Instead, you retreat back inside, only to discover that the smell has followed you. It lingers in the air, mixing oddly with the scent of damp wool and yesterday's stew. Over the next few days, Hilda's dyeing experiments escalate. Today it's blue, tomorrow red, and by the weekend, you swear you're living next to a rainbow-colored chemical factory operated by a particularly enthusiastic witch. Your own clothes now sport subtle shades of unintended purple stains, courtesy of the breeze carrying her dye into your laundry line. You consider confronting her, but quickly remember how the last time you tried to ask Ma to keep her chickens off your garden, you ended up with more eggshells in your boots than apologies. Instead, you start developing a routine of sniffing the air before stepping outside. If the scent is strong, you hide inside. If it's faint, you brave the outdoors but carry a cloth over your nose for protection. In the evenings, you can hear Hilda humming to herself while stirring her bubbling cauldron, an oddly soothing sound despite the persistent smell. It's moments like these you realize that medieval neighbors were not just sources of irritation. They were vibrant, living presences in your daily life, unpredictable, messy, and oddly comforting. They fill the spaces around you with color, noise, and sometimes, unfortunately, overpowering aromas. The village is a patchwork of shared experiences and overlapping lives. Privacy is minimal, and personal space is a concept best left to the nobility. You think about how different life is now compared to modern times. No smartphones to mute, no headphones to drown out a neighbor's relentless loot. Just the raw, unfiltered reality of people living closely together, whether they liked it or not. It's exhausting, it's frustrating, and sometimes it's downright maddening. But it's also the world you belong to. The world where disputes are settled over shared meals, fences are both battlegrounds and meeting places, and a neighbor's annoying habit is as much a part of the landscape as the rolling hills and muddy roads. As night falls and you lie down to sleep, the faint scent of Hilda's latest dye still clings to the breeze. You breathe it in, a little reluctantly, and drift off, knowing tomorrow will bring more of the same. More noise, more smells, more life. Because that's how medieval people dealt with annoying neighbors. They endured. You wake up to the muffled but unmistakable sound of shouting. Not the pleasant kind of shouting, like cheers at the village festival. No. This is the grumpy, frustrated shouting of old Harold, the village blacksmith, and his next-door neighbor, Etta. Now, Harold is a man who takes great pride in his craft. His forge is the heart of the village, filled with the rhythmic clanging of hammer on iron, sparks flying like tiny stars in the dusky air. But Harold's dedication comes with consequences. His forge emits smoke, noise, and a persistent heat that turns his workshop into a sauna for both himself and anyone unfortunate enough to be nearby. Etta, meanwhile, lives just across the thin wooden fence. She prefers quiet mornings, fresh air, and the kind of peace that doesn't include a dozen heated horseshoes landing on an anvil every 10 minutes. The two have been locked in a decades-long war over the placement of the forge, the direction of the smoke, and the exact decibel level of the hammering. Today's argument began over something as trivial as the location of Harold's new pile of scrap metal. Etta insists it's an eyesore, a health hazard, and possibly a secret breeding ground for rats. Harold argues that it's properly contained and not his problem. You, an innocent bystander, have learned to avoid the area during forge hours. But today, curiosity wins. You watch as the argument escalates. Harold gestures dramatically at his forge, claiming the smoke feeds the village spirit, whatever that means. Ed encounters with complaints about soot staining her freshly washed linens. Their voices rise, attracting the usual crowd of curious villagers. Someone suggests mediation. The Reeve, with the patience of a saint and the nerves of a tightrope walker, arrives and attempts to broker peace. After much debate, the solution is, well, a compromise. Harold agrees to build a small chimney to direct smoke upward, which may or may not work. Etta agrees to tolerate the scrap metal pile for another month, with the threat of it magically disappearing if rats appear. You think about the sheer energy these disputes consume. The village's unofficial motto might as well be, why solve problems simply when you can argue about them endlessly? But you also notice something else. Despite the noise, the smoke, and the constant bickering, there's a rhythm, a pattern, a kind of balance. Everyone knows where they stand. The boundaries are clear, even if the lines are constantly being redrawn through words and threats. You realize that medieval life was not about solitude or quiet. It was about coexistence. Messy, noisy, and imperfect coexistence. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough. As the sun sets, you hear Harold's hammering slow to a dull thump. Etta's muttering fades to soft sighs. And the village, noisy and flawed, settles into an uneasy peace. You close your eyes, ready to drift off. Because tomorrow there will be new complaints, new quarrels, and new reasons to question your sanity. But for now, just enough calm to sleep. You wake up to the subtle but unmistakable feeling that your personal space has been invaded. No, not by burglars or bandits, but by the ever-present phenomenon of medieval neighborly overspill. You step outside, barefoot on the cold, uneven stones, and immediately spot the problem: Maud's goats. They are, as usual, wandering freely across the village, and today their destination is your carefully tended vegetable patch. You try to shoo them away, but goats are stubborn creatures, bred for mischief as much as milk. They bleat defiantly and nibble on your prized cabbages like they own the place. This is a classic medieval dilemma. No fences are really strong enough or high enough to keep goats contained. And laws about animal trespass exist, but enforcement is another matter entirely. Maud, naturally, insists that the goats are just exercising their right to roam, a phrase that, in your mind, should come with a complimentary headache. You remind yourself that in medieval times, boundaries were more suggestions than rules. Property lines were often marked by worn stones or a row of bushes, both of which a determined goat could easily ignore. This constant mingling of space meant that neighbors' problems quickly became your problems. If Maud's goats eat your crops, you might end up short on food come winter. If Geoffrey builds fortifications, you lose a shortcut to the well. If Agnes borrows your things, well, you just get used to living with less. It's a delicate balance of patience, negotiation, and occasionally, strategic bribery. You think about the modern concept of privacy, a word that would have been meaningless in your world. No locks on doors, no curtains on windows. Just a village of people sharing every sight, sound, and smell, whether they wanted to or not. Sometimes, it feels like living inside a never-ending performance, with everyone as both audience and actors. And while it can be exhausting, it also means you're never truly alone. There's comfort in that, if you can look past the annoyances. You watch as Maud finally corrals her goats, grumbling but victorious. You sigh, thinking about tomorrow's inevitable new trials. Because in this village, every day brings something new. New disputes, new annoyances, new reasons to question your sanity. And yet, somehow, life goes on. With all its messiness, all its noise, and all its unexpected moments of kindness. You close your eyes, feeling the rough texture of your woolen blanket and the cool air on your skin. And you drift off, carried by the sounds of a world that never truly sleeps. A world where annoying neighbors aren't just a nuisance, they're part of the fabric of life. And where, despite it all, you learn to live, laugh, and occasionally lose your mind.